Good morning. I noticed there was an echo when Bonnie was talking. Can you hear that? Should I have the microphone up a little closer?
Yes.
Okay. Better?
That's better. Is that better?
So if you look off to my right there, leaning against the wall, is a land tract book. And so it records deeds of transfer. And how I came up with this subject, this topic today about the land speculators, I've looked through a number of those books, and there's one name that just kept popping out that was so unusual, and his name was Horatio Sanford. And so I've just kind of wondered, who is this guy? And so then that led to researching, because it always showed that he bought the land from the U.S. government. So I just wondered how all that worked out. So, Iowa land speculators, Sanford, Briggs, Boardman, Eldridge, etc. The record books of Iowa land transfers from 1838 to 1900 number by more than 75,000 large volumes, and they are scattered in courthouses throughout the state. And so I believe they're talking about books like that. And these books may have been duplicates because at one time they were in a law office. One of the major questions of American historians: did large-scale speculation in Western lands pay off? The Iowa land records permitted the first detailed study of this question on a significant area basis. This study indicated that speculator profits were extremely high in Iowa, at least for the big investors. And this was by the Iowa Land Records Collection, Periscope to the Past by Robert Syringa. And this is a page of a record or tract book, which again is what's leaning against the wall, showing grantees who purchased land from the government on the first three lines. You probably can't see that very well from there. This quote is from Pioneer and Profits. Land Speculation on the Iowa Frontier, again by Robert Syringa, Iowa State University, 1968. So the land speculator has been one of the devil figures in American history. Yet some of us have long been convinced that the frontier entrepreneur played an important role in opening up the frontier to settlement. Now, this important publication has sustained our beliefs and has laid to rest the dark image of the evil land speculator. Speculators rarely competed for lands chosen by actual settlers or members of claim clubs, for they needed their friendship of the inhabitants. Competition was keen between speculators for the remaining land, and few large speculators got all the land that they wanted. Even some large speculators were members of claim clubs, and even the small men in the claim clubs were speculators. For it was the rare squatter who was not a speculator. Indeed, there was a breed of men on the frontier who made a practice of taking claim after claim with the intention of selling it out as soon as they could. It is also erroneous, the author finds, to think that the large speculator grabbed land, held it off the market for years, or that he gouged the buyer with high prices. It was to the speculator's advantage to make his profits from quick and constant turnover of his funds. Thus, he was anxious to sell as quickly as possible and to take small unit profits, since his total profits would be large if his volume of sales were large. Interest rates were high, but affected everyone and were generally accepted as part of the frontier process. Generally, land speculation was profitable, the author contends, and was regarded as a safe investment. In short, the author finds that the non-resident land speculator was essential to the opening of the frontier. He brought capital and credit to the frontier, located land, brought in buyers to people the land, created jobs, supported newspapers, platted town sites, encouraged railways, and held public offices. Railroads played a significant role in land speculation, as they were often granted large amounts of land along the tracks, which they they would then sell to speculators who would further develop the land. A notable example of land speculation in Iowa occurred in the half-breed tract. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of that. It was new to me too. A region where Native American mixed heritage individuals were granted land, which speculators sought to acquire due to its potential value. Shown is the Sessions map from the Bureau of American Ethnology, a historical map of Iowa Indian lands. The Bureau of American Ethnology was established in 1879 by an act of Congress for the purpose of transferring archives, records, and materials relating to the Indians of North America from the Department of the Interior to the Smithsonian Institute. Prior to the year 1763, the entire continent of North America was divided between France, England, Spain, and Russia. In the 1700s and early 1800s, the area that is now Iowa was under the control of France, then Spain, and again France. In 1834, the area that is now Iowa was attached to the Michigan Territory, and in 1836, it was transferred to the Wisconsin Territory. The Iowa Territory was established in 1838. It included all of present-day Iowa, Minnesota, and parts of North and South Dakota. In 1846, Iowa, with its present boundaries, became a state. Iowa was opened for pioneer settlement in 1833. Over the next 20 years, the land that we now know as Iowa was gradually negotiated or ceded away from the Indian group who lived in Iowa. The map illustrates these land areas, also called cessions. A cession is something such as a territory that is ceded to another group. Where Indian groups once lived, large numbers of pioneers now came to settle in Iowa. First, they settled in the eastern counties. Gradually, they moved west until by 1870, pioneer settlers had purchased land and built homes and farms in every county of the state. Land speculation sometimes led to legal disputes, as people questioned the legitimacy of land claims or faced issues with unclear property boundaries. Land in Iowa was surveyed and by law was laid out in an orderly system of congressional townships. A township was defined as an area 6 miles on each side. Each township was divided into sections of 1 square mile, and sections were numbered from 1 to 36. Usually a section was broken down and sold by the half section, quarter section, or even smaller unit. When compared to settlement of the East and the South, this system of townships was orderly. Farms and fields in New England had been surveyed by individual settlers, which left a number of irregular tracts that no one owned. Jacob Mullen Eldridge was one of the most important landowners, speculators, and developers in the early days of Davenport and the surrounding area. For many years leading up to his death in 1902, he was considered the encyclopedia of local history, being one of the oldest remaining members of the Old Settlers Association. Eldridge was a Republican and was present in Iowa City when the party was organized. In 1872, he was a delegate to the Liberal Republican Convention in Cincinnati, Ohio. Shown is an advertisement for Eldridge's business located on Brady Street in Davenport. Eldridge was born in 1924, and after his mother died when he was 4, he went to live with his grandparents. When he was 13, his grandfather passed away, and he was left to his own devices for survival. He set out as an independent teamster with a pair of oxen and a wagon until he was 19. He sold his team and traveled to Washington, calling on President John Tyler, engaged in the grain business in Camden, New York 1 year, then headed for Rock Island, arriving December 23, 1845, after 2 months of hard travel from Philadelphia. He came to Davenport the next day, which had a population of 500, and made the city his home. He bought land near Davenport, paying $1.25 an acre, and all of it for $125 in 1872. He named Jersey Ridge Road after his hometown in New Jersey, and he put a house and a fruit farm on his land. 9 children were born to him and his wife, Mary High Williams. They moved to the city because the farm was not lucrative and the children needed to go to school. He was one of the first land agents in the Davenport area. His father was an early settler, and by March 1851 was advertising land for sale in the newspapers of New York City and Washington, D.C. It was at that time that he reportedly advised his readers to "Go west, young man," a famous phrase later credited to Horace Greeley. He also purchased and sold businesses like flipping houses. He owned thousands of acres of undeveloped land in Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory. He also had an interest in a 3,000-acre farm near Eldridge, North Dakota, which was called the Davenport Farm. On July 2, 1871, he filed the plat of the town of Eldridge Junction, now Eldridge. So I'm not sure then if they're referring to North Dakota or if they're referring to our Eldridge, Iowa. This was from his obituary, so it just left that information off. He was prominent in attracting a number of railroads to cross the Mississippi and Davenport as they headed west through Iowa. He was a member of the company that built the second railroad bridge across the river, and the Davenport streetcar lines were established largely through his efforts. This is the last home of Eldridge shown in photo, located in Davenport, Iowa. Does anybody recognize that house? I mean, it looks so familiar, but... Horatio Sanford. So I had thought that, okay, this is really an unusual name, and then when I started looking for where he was buried, I found more than 9 other individuals with that same name in the U.S. So I just have wondered, as I mentioned before, for a long time, who was this man? And I thought maybe he worked for the government. I just didn't really know. Horatio Sanford was Iowa's biggest buyer and seller of land prior to the Civil War. He entered the land on Mexican War land warrants, for which he paid 50 cents an acre. Sanford was born in 1813, which is the same year that Julian Dubuque died. Shown is a list of the 10 busiest land offices for warrant locations. Most of the end users were farmers who bought warrants on credit at high rates of interest from frontier land bankers. Notice Dubuque had one of the largest number of land offices in Iowa, and that would make sense since they're the oldest city west of the Mississippi. 2 land office grants were signed by President Franklin Pierce. The grantees were Marcus D.L. Simpson and Horatio W. Sanford. Between 1846 and 1858, Sanford's net worth increased from $10,000 to over $100,000. He was involved in 2,879 private land deals. Many of these involved tracts in Jackson County as well as Dubuque County. Sanford never hired a clerk or entrusted his business to anyone else. I should mention he never married, had children. He purchased the Sanford block in Dubuque in 1856. He made most of his purchases of city property in 1854 and 55. By then, most of the public land in eastern Iowa was sold. Although he did not sell much until after 1860, all of his property in the country had been sold by 1865. Over 1 million acres of land in northern Iowa passed through his company, which is just amazing. Horatio Sanford was an organizer of the Dubuque and Pacific Railroad. He withdrew due to the speculative nature of the business and invested his money in government bonds and securities. Upon his retirement from business, Sanford became one of Dubuque's most traveled citizens, with at least 7 tours to Europe and others to Africa and South America. Seen in the foreground of the photo is the Lorimer House. The Dubuque Custom House and Post Office is seen across the street, and the tower of the First Congregational Church is observed to the left. During his life, Sanford boarded at the Lorimer House and often had his meals brought to his room. Built by Peter Lorimer in 1857, it was the largest hotel in the city in 1871. It was destroyed by fire on July 5, 1917, and the site was later used for the construction of the home for the Telegraph Herald. Sanford was fond of remembering his hometown of Dubuque. He had a congregational church built and then donated it to the congregation in memory of his parents. His mother, Sarah Lynn, died in 1844, and his father, Edmund, in 1860. His siblings, Caroline, Charles, Edmund, and Sarah, preceded him in death. Shown is the dinner menu from the Lorimer House, dated July 19, 1885. And it shows in there that, it did cost extra to have meals delivered to your room, which is what Sanford had done, but he could more than afford to pay that fee. Sanford conducted his land sales at the corner of 4th and Main, and later 184 Main, and finally 852 Main. Land warrants versus land patents. And I've read this like a million times, and it's not sticking with me, but a federal land warrant is good for a specific acreage of property in the federal domain without stating precisely where that property is at. A federal land patent is a document that transfers titles to a specific piece of property from the federal government to an individual. So it's kind of like the warrant, you really didn't necessarily know what you were getting. Capitalists could obtain warrants for less than $1.25 an acre charged by the government for public land and save themselves money when locating large quantities of land. Some of the speculators were Southerners or Easterners working through Western agents. John Culbertson of Iowa City and Horatio Sanford of Dubuque were prominent resident Iowa speculators. The land warrant was legal authorization for a surveyor to set boundaries for a parcel of land. The possible location of the land was set by the legislation that authorized issuing a patent for land. Some of the legislation had authorized giving bounty land in exchange for military service, and for some, War of 1812 service. Already surveyed parcels were available in Arkansas, Illinois, and other places, and the lots assigned to veterans or their heirs were determined by drawings. Other land was available by outright sale, including as a means to fund certain schools, or was put up for sale in the famous land rushes. Persons entitled to military service bounty land often did not go to live on their entitlements, but sold them to speculators, who often sold them to the people that eventually settled. So these are some of the names I'm going to talk about here in a minute. They're considered speculators. Some of them I don't know if they, dealt in large amounts of land or just what they needed to farm. But these names were all found in that book. David S. Swaney, whose family was one of the first to settle Van Buren Township, was a land speculator. Swaney bought a parcel that was a military warrant assigned to him from Peter Hoffman, who was a carriage maker in Colonel Baker's detachment, and it was signed by President Millard Fillmore in 1851. Among other purchases, he purchased a state volume patent in 1848. So this David Swaney, he was the brother-in-law of Mrs. Fletcher Swaney, and kind of learned a lot about Mrs. Fletcher Swaney because she wrote a letter to her friends back east, and it was dated 1884, and telling her friends about her pioneer experience. And actually, I do have that one ready to go at some point for another brown bag lunch. Land speculator Israel Day was a Sebula resident. He died in 1867 in Sebula. John B. Dwinell was also a Jackson County land speculator, and he made his purchases through the Dubuque Land Office. John C. Higginson bought and sold a lot of land in Jackson County. I find his name over and over and over. In 1860, John Higginson, age 35, was married with 3 children, living in Dubuque, and his occupation listed on the census was land agent, so this was his full-time job. His real estate value was $40,000, and that was pretty good for 1860. And his personal estate was $1,000. So the next 3 slides show a land warrant that was purchased by John C. Higginson. It was assigned to him by James Lovell, a private in Captain Tollsman Company, Massachusetts militia, War of 1812. Official plat of survey of the said lands returned to the general office by the Surveyor General, which has been assigned to John Higginson. In testimony whereof, I, Franklin Pierce, President of the United States, the 10th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1853. Richard Wyckoff, Van Buren Township farmer, was a land speculator. Born in New York in 1815, the 1870 census lists his real estate as being valued at $10,000. He is buried in Van Buren Township. Nathan Tompkins was a land speculator, and he's buried in Buckeye. William McAdeo, private in Captain Ladies Company, 1st Regiment, Virginia Militia, assigned his land to William Joshua Barney. Barney also bought land that was assigned to him from a corporal in Captain Shepherd's Company, Maryland Militia, and land assigned from Joseph Goodwin, private in Captain Hubbard's Company, 5th Regiment, Virginia Militia. Most of the land he acquired in 1853, and sometimes he did buy his land with other men as well. He bought numerous Jackson County parcels. Has anyone ever come across that name before? Ebenezer Osborne, and I think Don Wentworth might have a connection to this person. A Van Buren resident and farmer bought land on a military warrant. The land was assigned to him by a private in Captain Sutton's company, Texas Mounted Volunteers. Land patents. The rights offered by a land patent take precedence over any other land ownership document or agreement. All U.S. land can be tracked back to land patents, which are sometimes referred to as first title deeds. Before land was offered to people, it was surveyed and mapped into a grid of townships, each township measuring 6 miles by 6 miles, or 23,040 acres, and broken into 36 sections, each measuring 1 mile by 1 mile. When you see a reference, and that book does show these references, when you see a reference of Township 86, Range 5, it is referring to the original survey results from the early to mid-1800s, for Iowa anyway. So I put together a list of people who bought land from Horatio Sanford, grouped by township. However, this is only a small fraction, because when I started doing this, I didn't realize just how many acres he had sold. And these are all sales he made in Jackson County. And when you look at these, you'll see there are quite a few names that, none of those descendants are in this area anymore, but then a few are local names. And I'm just going to let you read I'm going to take a break from reading. I'll let you read these. For Butler Township. Farmers Creek. Jackson. Macokota. Otter Creek, Prairie Springs, Perry, Richland. Actually, I'm looking at the wrong slide as I'm reading it on. I'm one behind. This is Perry Township. And the next one, Richland. Sometimes I forget 2 slides show up on here. I have to look at the right one. South Fork. And so we had some women that bought land from him. Katie Moore. Union. The first recorded Euro-American settlement, Iowa's current counties. The names listed with the date of 1837 for Jackson County. Jones, Armstrong, Reed, Nicholson, Dias, and then it says various. So probably too many to put on this map. Horatio Sanford was born in Sherburne, located in Chenango County, New York. He attended school there until the age of 14, when his thoughts and aspirations were turned to the west, the utmost limit of which was then considered to be the shores of the Mississippi. It was said Dubuque was just 2 years old with 500 inhabitants when he arrived, and Dubuque was founded in 1833. So in 1835, Horatio would have been around 22 years old. Map of Dubuque shown is from 1846. Upon his arrival, he tried to seek employment as a merchant's clerk. He felt this was the only employment that he was suited for. He tried for several weeks, and with no success. He then decided to go to the country, and he was determined to save his $100 and invest it in some way for profit should an opportunity come along. He packed up and started up the cooler on foot to look for work. He passed over the prairie, which is now the center of population, referring to the Yurgistad, and the business of Dubuque, and entered Cooler Valley. Am I saying that word right, Cooler? Is that how you say it? Cooler Valley. He saw men making hay and offered his work for board. Haymaker Jesse Mooring looked at the slim, spare youth before him and declined. The haymaker didn't think Sanford could work hard enough to be worth 3 meals a day. He went further north and soon reached the town of Sageville. He received dinner from one of the settlers along the Little Maquoketa, but did not find any work. He kept traveling and reached the last cabin in 3 miles, but no one wanted to furnish board for help. Sanford was afraid to cross the hills and prairies in fear of being lost or encountering hostile Indians. So he decided to retreat and ask everyone on the way back to Dubuque for employment. That night he approached the spot where present-day fairgrounds are, and he saw 2 lead miners standing by their rudely constructed cabin. They were 2 bachelors by the name of Carson. When young Sanford explained his situation, the Carsons agreed to provide him with board until he could find other employment. He spent that winter sleeping on the floor of their cabin. Later, the Carsons helped him find employment with a dry goods and grocery dealer, Messrs. Sleater and Smoker. He worked for them for about a year, but then they closed business. The next merchant he was employed by also closed after a year. He then became a clerk for F.K. O'Farrell, then one of the most prosperous of Dubuque merchants. Has anyone ever heard of O'Farrell? He took nearly the entire charge of Mr. O'Farrell's business, as well as that of O'Farrell and Harbison, smelters, for 5 years. While working for the second merchant, Sanford bought his first investment in real estate, a lot on the west side of Bluff Street, north of 5th. Soon he began loaning money at, get this, 25% interest. The rate then paid. He gained considerable money and bought several lots. He then clerked for William Walther. Then he decided to go into business for himself and was loaning money and buying real estate. In 4 years' time, he had accumulated $30,000. He had a land office in the back room of a store. So I don't know what his terms were, and maybe they didn't make monthly payments. Maybe they made, yearly payments or when the crops came in, but like at 25% interest, 40 acres, if they paid $1.25 an acre, it would be $50. So their total payments over that time would have been $136.50, and $86.50 would have been interest. And then they did the same thing there for 60 months as well. And so if they paid monthly, $1.47 a month, it just seems incredible. During the first half of the 19th century, a number of American states prohibited the establishment of banks of issue within their borders. In theory, these states seemingly opted for the slow economic development associated with an inelastic currency supply. In the case of Iowa, however, the people's demand for an elastic currency was met by the creation of substitute financial institution, land agency banks, that functioned as de facto banks of issue. And this is what Sanford was doing. And I just came across, we talked about this being a safe endeavor, but I came across, and I should have taken a picture of it, where there was a land agent here in Maquoketa, and he basically was sending that message as an advertisement to his creditors. It's like, hey, you need to pay me. So sometimes maybe it was hard to collect. Sanford's land sales were a successful venture. Having made over $100,000, he spent 6 months in Europe in 1858. 1859, he traveled to Russia, as shown on left, and Middle Asia, shown on the right. And that's about what they would have looked like at that time. His vast wealth allowed him to travel to Palestine and Egypt in 1862. In 1865, he spent a winter in Egypt, and he ascended the Nile. In 1867, he attended the Paris Exposition, and in 1873, the World's Fair, which was held in Vienna. He then returned to Paris in 1878. 1800s photo of Palestine, Egypt, the Paris Exposition of 1867 that he attended, and an 1873 photo of the World's Fair held in Vienna. Sanford accumulated an estate worth nearly $1.5 million. At the time of his death, he owned nearly a block of city real estate and other parcels about the city in Dubuque. However, most of his wealth was in government bonds and other securities. Horatio Walcott Sanford was the son of Edmund and Sarah. He's buried in New York with his 2 sisters. Horatio died while visiting his brother Sidney in New York. He was stricken with heart disease 6 weeks earlier, and that was the cause of his death. Sidney, his youngest and only surviving sibling, died in 1908 and was married with one son named Charles Horatio. His son died at age 40, but had been married, and a son survived him. So I don't know if that family, if there's any Sanfords, I didn't check to see if there's any around Dubuque yet. Even though many say they who are rich are therefore dishonest. However, Mr. Sanford was both honest and rich. Horatio even sold land to Ansel Briggs. A second deed was made as the first deed was reported lost. Ansel Briggs, Iowa's first governor, was a large holder of real estate and frequently bought and sold Iowa land, as detailed in the Ansel Briggs Project. In 1853, Briggs helped found and was vice president of the Great Northwestern Railroad Company. It was from the profits of his stagecoach business that Briggs began purchasing land in and around the little Jackson County village of Andrew and reselling it to incoming Easterners. Ansel's father, Benjamin, was killed while driving one of Ansel's wagons loaded with salt around 1825. In 1854, Briggs became an early investor in the Florence Land Company of Nebraska Territory and was one of the founders of the town of Florence, Nebraska. In Iowa and Illinois, speculators had a great field day in acquiring millions of acres of land before settlers were ready to select and improve them. And later, immigrants had to pay higher prices for these lands to compensate the speculator for his foresight. During the decade of the 1850s, some 17 million acres of public lands in Iowa were entered by and the titles conveyed to speculators, and settlers, and in addition, considerable quantities of 7,400 acres of swamp, school, and internal improvement land granted to the state passed to buyers. Yet the census of 1860 shows that 7,234,000 acres had been made into farms. So more than 1/3 of the state was held by persons not residing on their land, many of whom were from out of state. Small acreages were being developed for town sites or were bought by persons who intended to develop farms on their holdings. But that still leaves a minimum of 12 million acres of land suitable for farming, on which the census takers found no evidence of improvement, sufficient enough that it could be called farmland. So there was extensive acreage that was not owned by the railroads and was not in farms. I was kind of surprised to hear about that. 12 million acres of land owned presumably by investors and speculators was generally acquired legally, but not always. Newly surveyed lands were open only to preemption prior to the public auction, and speculators, large or small, who were anxious to secure desirable locations could induce persons to file a preemption entry on them, take title, and then transfer the ownership to the sponsor for a small fee. It almost sounds like, one of those scams you hear now, you give me this, I'll give you this money and pay you a fee or something, what I'm talking about. Yeah. So I wonder how many people got scammed on that deal too. William Chaplin Boardman was born March 22nd, 1804 in Norwich, Vermont. He had become very wealthy due to land speculation and other business ventures. He grew up in New England and came to Jackson County in 1856. After settling in Maquoketa, he continued to sell platform scales, which he had sold when connected with Fairbanks and Company. In 1855, he had purchased over 1,000 acres of wild land in western Iowa. At that time, the best of government land could be bought for $1 an acre. He personally inspected every 40 of that land, and with keen foresight knew the coming value of what he was buying. This proved to be a valuable investment for Boardman. He was married to Mary Benton in 1831, and they both dearly loved children, but were not able to have any. So the first of the American branch of the Boardman family settled in Ipswich, Massachusetts, 17 years after the Mayflower made port. William's grandmother was a descendant of Governor Carver of Plymouth, so he was both of Puritan and Pilgrim stock. So the quote in Ellis' history book, Boardman was a chip off the old block. Had he been born 50 years sooner and in Massachusetts instead of Vermont, no doubt he would have been at Lexington with a musket in his hand. He was of sturdy build, nearly 6 feet tall, endowed by nature with a good degree of health and strength, and with his full share of Yankee diligence, thrift, and foresight. No one could truthfully say of him that he ever asked for anything to which he was not entitled. The Boardmans are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Maquoketa, and the inscription reads, "Now we three meet again." So, I'm not sure, they didn't have any children. So the three, would that just be referring to God then? I don't know. Boardman's will. He gave $5,000 for a public library in Maquoketa, and his will set aside $5,000 providing that a corporation should be created. It would receive this endowment for its perpetuation of a capital of $500. Mr. Boardman made no pretensions of being a learned man or to literature. He never made a so-called speech in his life. And although he did not have critical knowledge in literary matters, he valued education. Also in his will, he gave $1,000 to the son of his pastor, and that turned out to be Robert A. Millikan, who is in our Hall of Fame, and was a famous scientist, for those of you that have not heard that before. And he was the son of Reverend S.F. Millikan, who was the pastor of Boardman's Church. He also, in his will, gave, or actually the present church building was enlarged during the leadership of Millikan, and Boardman had purchased, this would be prior to his death, a parsonage for that minister at a cost of $2,100. Shown is the United Church of Christ as it looks today on East Platte Street, formerly the Congregational Church. And this photo taken in 1908. In 1878, the church was rebuilding their place of worship. And they decided that they wanted stained glass, so they ordered windows, but they really didn't have much money, so they were rather plain stained glass windows. And when Boardman saw those, he said, if you send those back, I will buy you, some nicer stained glass windows. And of course, they took him up on that. This is one of the windows that he purchased. And close up, it reads, in memoriam, Mrs. William C. Boardman, presented by her husband. So this is kind of some interesting things here about what they said about Mrs. Boardman. So his wife came from the Benton family, which on its native health ranked among the 400 of that generation. Mrs. Boardman in intellect was in no respect behind her husband. So they're kind of saying that she was smarter than he was. But then they go on to say she was gifted in every respect, except perhaps in striking personal beauty. Why would someone write something like that? and except in having a family of children, and she had none. Mrs. Boardman never forgot the annual Christmas tree, nor the interest of her Sunday school class in the joyful event. And so she decorated the tree with handmade rabbits. I don't know what the significance is of rabbits and Christmas, but they said it was lovely to see all of those rabbits on the branches of the trees, of the tree. So the city of Maquoketa is host to one of Andrew Carnegie's original library projects. It opened in 1904 and is one of Maquoketa's hidden treasures. Legal battles over the name of the library began due to the stipulations in Boardman's will. And because of this, the library for a while was called the Boardman-Carnegie Library, and it's divided. So the Carnegie Library includes the fiction and novels, and the Boardman had the nonfiction and the history room. And it's still kind of like that today, I believe. So the Maquoketa Literary Society was organized as early as 1851, and the Boardman Library Institute was founded in 1885. So the community had applied for the grant from Carnegie to build the library, and in 1902 they were awarded $12,500. The total cost for the project, including the land, was $15,000, so they were able to raise money through the public and contributions and entertainments. Architect Henry Netcock designed the neoclassical building, and it was individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1989 and is a contributing property in the West Pleasant Street Historic District in 1991. And then in 1998, our addition was built on the north side. Maquoketa Excelsior ad, December 29, 1898, Boardman Library. So this is prior, to the public library being built. If you are interested in the mental development of that boy or girl, buy him or her a reading ticket in the Boardman Library. Nothing could be more suitable. It would make a suitable New Year's gift for any member of the family. 4 years later, reading tickets would no longer be required, as the library was now free to the public. Does anybody know on those reading tickets, was it just a one-time, you could just go that one time? 1902, citizens voted 4-1 to approve new library, and 16 people pledged money. In 1980, the Boardman gift was terminated. It had been used to purchase periodicals, the number between 25 and 26,000. After the library edition, accredited was granted, and what had kept the library from being accredited earlier was it was not handicap accessible because of the steps. And most of you are aware that John Cressy Construction completed that wonderful addition to our library, and it's just truly amazing how it blends with the original. And in 2004, the library celebrated its 100th birthday. 2018, it was reported that 4,000 to 5,000 people visit the library each month. Did you know that there were that many visitors each month? So we had our business across the street from there, and I would see, how heavily it was being used. I guess I don't know that I, counted that many people each day. But when the addition was being built, I had people, this was almost on a daily basis, that complained, that were upset, that didn't want their taxes to go up. And so at that time, and I read back things, and it says the board members bragged about how they had the support of the whole community. I'm telling you, I witnessed a very different perspective, because there were just so many people that were against it. And that is the end. Does anyone have any questions? Now you know a little bit about land speculation. And there's a lot more to know about land speculation, for sure. But I was really surprised at that 25% interest. That just blew me away. Thank you. Bonnie? Yes.
I just wanted to say, she mentioned that William Boardman made, even though he made his money speculating with land, he sold the Fairbanks scales.
Yes.
And we do have one of those out in the depot.
Oh, we have a Fairbanks.
We do. It's a big, that they would weigh like sacks of grain and things like that. It's large.
So I didn't know that.
We do have one.
I'll have to take a look at it.
Anyway, wonderful job.